Welcome to the latest episode of Gryphon Manor. Now, in the last episode, I had deviated from my regularly scheduled programming to tap into the trio of iron veins I discovered north of the village of Andover, and I built a small vertical mine and then installed 3 ore extractors to pull iron ore out of the mine. Of course, there was a fair bit of support stuff that went into that, including a lift, some non-traditional windmills, living and workshop space for the workers, and even a few workstations that brought my first immersive engineering merchants into this world. And now I'm bringing in a steady flow of iron ore, so that's one more resource I won't need to worry about as I build out this world. Besides, my doctor said I needed more iron. Now I have it. But this is a whole new episode, and it is time to return to the village of Andover for an expansion. Now, the last time I worked in the village, I had built a large and comfortable inn and discovered that there were no villagers left in Andover. So I then had to sort all that out, and it looks like the changes are still working. Now it's time to build the village hall, and I think that finishing the inn and the hall will establish the core of the village from which I can plan and build the rest. Assuming, of course, that I can keep the villagers alive long enough to actually have a working village. But before I can talk about my plans for the hall, I want to spend a few moments talking about what the hall actually is. And yes, that is a hall, but he's not what I'm talking about. And yes, that is a hall. In fact, it's a hall within the hall, but that's still not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something like this. In the real world, village halls were traditionally used as a meeting place for the village or town, and it was where folks met for meetings, holidays, festivals, fiestas, gender reveals, network gaming parties, or pretty much whatever. In some cases, they were also a place from which the local administration would work and govern, or perhaps misgovern, the community. Now, not all communities had them, and those that did tended to put whatever resources they could into them so that these halls were often a fair representation of the relative wealth and prosperity of the community they served. And basically, this was the case for centuries, and the concept was pretty useful, so much so that after World War I, the government of the United Kingdom spun up a formal program to put one of these in every village and town, and they built over 10,000 of them in the decade after the war, and for the most part, they're still in use. Therefore, it would make sense, at least in my feeble and aged mind, to build something like that for the good people of Andover. And here's what I'm thinking. I want to build a building that will wrap around a central courtyard that would serve as the focus of the village square and provide a space for the weekly market. Not that I intend to set up a market there, but you get your general idea. Now, there would be at least one great hall for the largest of meetings and events, but I expect there might be a few smaller rooms for meetings and meals, and there would be a fairly substantial kitchen on the grounds to support those events. And of course, there has to be a clock for letting the villagers keep track of the time as they bustle about the village. I'm still on the fence about putting some offices into the mix. These would be for the local council or whatever they're going to be. In fact, I've spun up a whole train of thought around specialty villagers and moving away from the emerald-based economy, but I'm still working that bit out in my head. But one of the professions I'm batting around is something like a mayor or perhaps a council member. Now, I have absolutely no idea what they would offer in trades, perhaps nothing, just like a vanilla villager nitwit. And that would certainly make a lot of sense on a few levels, but I digress. This building would be a representation of the village's prosperity over the years, so it would probably be a newer building, more representative of the late 19th century, and probably all brick, but with a fair bit of ornamentation and flair. In other words, very Victorian, or at least as detailed as I can get it with the materials on hand. After all, this is Minecraft, so details tend to be limited to 1 cubic meter in size, which is not very detailed at all. But that's pretty much it for the plan. The hardest parts, or at least the most laborious and tedious parts of this build, will be the terraforming and in producing all the bricks necessary for the job. Way back in episode 7, I described, or to be more precise, I made up, the general historical background of Andover. And at that time, I described how a small tower or keep was built at the end of this row of hills, and as the need for a fort diminished, it was eventually abandoned and used for building materials, and over time, a small church was built on the site of the old fortifications. Now, I'm still holding to all of that, but as I noted when building the Rose and Crown, the hills that were generated by the game when I started this world are a bit too extreme. Certainly not in the Minecraft sense, but definitely too much for a little slice of rural England. And to look at this hill before I cut into it, one would think that it's not much of a hill in the first place. But once you're running around with a pick and shovel and trying to slim it down, you can trust me when I say that you get a very different impression indeed. Of course, I need to wear away the hill to achieve my vision of Andover, but there is an added bonus in all this that the material will come in handy for the building and terraforming to come. After all, I won't always be tearing down hills. I've already started draining the river to nowhere, and much of that will need to be filled in somewhat. And back in episode 13, when I described all the various regions of this world and my plans for them, I mentioned that there will be a space modeled after the Netherlands. And like the actual Netherlands, I will need to reclaim proper land from the swamps, marshes, and shallow waters to be found there. And that will require quite a bit of fill material as well. However, I'm looking forward to that task as I think I will find it fulfilling. Of course, carving up the hills, producing other resources. I'm already producing iron and coal, and so the need to go out and find that stuff in the wild is pretty much a thing of the past. However, I don't have such facilities for other materials like copper or zinc, so finding patches of those materials during this work is still pretty useful. I've also noticed that since the Caves and Cliffs updates, there seems to be a lot less andesite, diorite, and granite to be found, and that's a bit of a shame as I can easily create cobblestone, but my ability to create those other materials is drastically limited. One could even say rocky. Now, this is important because one of the things that a serious builder wants and needs is plenty of different materials from which to build. It just gives us more options. After all, back in elementary school, nobody really liked working with a box of crayons that had only 8 colors. We always wanted the big old box of 64 colors with the built-in sharpener, even though we never touched half of those colors. But I'm digressing again. With the terraforming pretty much out of the way, the next thing will be the creation of bricks. A lot of bricks. I needed a lot of worn bricks when creating the Rose and Crown, but in that case, the Domnum Ornamentum mod essentially gave me bonus blocks when I created those framed blocks. In other words, I used a lot more brick blocks in the building than what I had actually used up out of my inventory, and I kind of like that, especially in a survival world. However, this project's going to be different. I plan to build almost the entire building out of bricks, and since I'm trying to go for a more modern design, I won't be using the open timber blocks. Therefore, I will be using these brick blocks directly, so I will need a crazy number of them. And while the terraforming took a long time and a lot of effort, brick making will take even more. Luckily, there's nothing particularly magical or limiting in this effort, and I will be using the vanilla Minecraft mechanics to produce the massive amounts of clay that I'll need. In case you're not familiar with how this is done, the process starts with blocks of dirt. I put the dirt on a special platform that I've built. The platform is comprised of dripstone blocks with a dripstone point underneath each. And once the dirt's in place, I then wet each individual block of dirt with a bottle of water. Now, this can also be accomplished with a working faucet from the Supplementaries mod, but since this whole operation is currently manual, the fastest method at the moment is still using the bottles of water. Wetting the blocks of dirt transforms them into blocks of mud, and when the mud sits on this particular platform, they will theoretically drain themselves and eventually transform into blocks of clay, which are then harvested as balls of clay, which in turn are fired to produce clay bricks, and those are reassembled into blocks of bricks. In this case, I want the worn bricks from the Create Deco mod, so before I assemble the bricks into blocks, I fire them a second time, which transforms them into the darker worn bricks, and then I finally assemble them. So for each block of dirt, I get 1 block of worn bricks, which is a decent enough ratio, but it's all that processing in between that can be a bit of a pain in the butt. Luckily, you don't have to sit through all of that. And while I do need to wait, I'm free to do other stuff while I do wait. So I will be harvesting crops and such in the meanwhile. And all of those resources are still manually handled and processed at the moment, and I don't pay much attention to them when I have enough building materials on hand, because I would much rather spend my time building than farming. And I'm pretty sure that last statement has many of my ancestors turning over in their graves. With the hill out of the way, literally, and plenty of bricks on hand, it's time to get the show on the road. Now, I also need a lot of wood, and instead of tapping into my strategic reserve, it makes a lot more sense to just plant some trees on the site and cut them down here and there to locally produce the wood that I'll need for this project. Now, since I like to use materials that would be locally available to the village, and this village will border an oak and dark oak forest, those are the woods I will be using. Now, I will use oak for floors and ceilings and dark oak for the roof and any trim. As you may have guessed, I did lay out the design of this building ahead of time using my template in Excel, and the overall design is based on my 5x5x5 module scale. The overall design is based on the design points I mentioned at the beginning of this video, a largish building that surrounds a central courtyard that's open to the south. And the courtyard is the village square and is intended as both a public space and the place to host weekly markets. In fact, I will have a market cross or something like that in the center of the courtyard to make it official. Inside the building, most of the rooms will be fairly open and intended for use as meeting spaces or as venues for events. I will have one functional room in which I will set up a large kitchen for catering big events, because nothing brings out folks like food. And if the food is free, well, then folks will be coming from the whole region for a free feed. Well, it might not quite work out like that in Minecraft, but I'm sure you would agree that it definitely works exactly like that in real life. And, I'm sorry, did you need something? Off with you. Come back at tea time. Sorry about that. As I mentioned earlier, this design is intended to be modern in the steampunk sense, but buildings of that era also sported a lot of ornamentation and detail, especially buildings meant to convey the wealth and importance of the individual or community that owned them. Unfortunately, it is really hard to add or even represent that kind of detail in Minecraft, even modded Minecraft, but I will try to do my best. Of course, as prosperous as Andover will eventually be, it's not the palace at Versailles, so I'm going for something that is reasonably grand, but still within the realm of a village or small town. And once the dust settles, there we go. I obviously spent quite a bit of time in the village while working on this project, so I had plenty of time to observe the locals and gauge how well the restored population of the village was functioning, and as it turns out, it wasn't. First off, the villagers refused to use the modded beds provided by the Fantasies Furniture mod. The modded beds were removed from the ground floor and vanilla beds put in their place, and once those beds were in place, the villagers started using them. Or at least they were trying to use them. I had forgotten that the height of villagers means that they can barely fit through a door, so if there's pretty much anything on the other side of the door, say a patch of carpet, the villager can't get through the door. So I removed the carpeting and villagers were finally actually using beds. And that's when I saw my first golem spawn, which I was pretty jazzed about. That was also when I started to see stray cats spawn, and I was less happy about that. I mean, I do love cats, but I generally prefer much quieter cats than Minecraft cats. Unfortunately, I still had a problem in that there were no little villagers. Now, I tried all sorts of things to encourage that, and I spent a lot of time in the config files to see if there were settings I could play with there. Ultimately, I turned off the female villager mod, and voila, baby villagers were popping up all over the place. And yes, I totally understand the irony that getting rid of all the females resulted in a baby boom, but it's modded Minecraft, so just go with the flow here. I also noticed that the windmills at the Watsaurus mine are causing some performance problems. And whenever I'm facing those windmills, whether I can see them or something is blocking my view, the frame rate drops drastically. And the problem pretty much goes away when I turn off the shaders. So this has me seriously reconsidering my whole base design and automation strategy. But I'm still in the middle of a lot of messy thoughts there, and I will share more once I get it better sorted out. However, the village hall is now finished. I haven't placed any beds in this building, so it won't house any additional villagers, but there is a cooking pot set up in the kitchen, so now we have a chef running around the village, and that's fine. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's the same guy that kept gazing at the pot through the window while I was building it. Perhaps he's finally achieved his lifelong dream to be a chef. On a completely random note, I would like to take a moment to discuss the freaking clock. Basically, I had two options for a working clock. I could go with the Create mod clockwork bearing, or I could use a single block clock from the supplementaries mod. The problem with the Create option, besides that I would need rotational power and the performance headaches that's already causing, is that any clock that would be sufficiently large enough to look decent using the bearing would be grossly disproportionate to the buildings I have here. However, choosing the single block clock from supplementaries, as I eventually wound up doing, resulted in a clock that is just a tad too small. However, the clock block was the lesser of the two evils, and with some creative block manipulation of the tower, I came up with something that kind of sort of works. So let's take a peek inside. The upper floor of the west wing is filled with clusters of tables and chairs suitable for several smaller meetings or groups of diners. If there were board games or role-playing games in Minecraft, I expect this is exactly where the villagers would go to play them. It would also be where the village would feed folks if they hosted some kind of fundraising lunch or pancake breakfast or something like that. The main room on the top floor is set up with rows of chairs facing the center of the room for speaking engagements. Now, I would imagine that one could probably make a lucrative living in a Minecraft world by lecturing the locals on topics of interest, including controlling the creeper population, preventing raids, how to take turns opening the damn door, and best practices for finding your own damn bed at night. And the upper floor of the east wing is set up like a boardroom with one large table and many chairs. And if you've ever played a tabletop role-playing game, invariably there would be a time where your party went to an inn or something like that and tried to get a private room where they could eat and discuss their plans in relative privacy. This is the room for that. And while the good guys were planning their next moves, there would probably be a similar meeting between the bad guys for plotting theirs. And with this second meeting room, there is space for that as well. The main room of the ground floor has been kept mostly clear, with the chairs moved to the edge of the room as for a dance or ball. And with the handy-dandy inclusion of a clock tower in the same building, any enchanting young lady, or enchanted young lady, would have everything they needed to hook their prince and then beat feet back home by midnight when her dress and her carriage revert back to what they originally were. Of course, feeding a lot of folks requires having a fairly large kitchen with lots of open workspace. As the main source of cooked meals in my own family, I often lament the cramped space and lack of countertops in most modern kitchens. So you can see how that influenced this design. There is plenty of counter and workspace, and quite frankly, I'm a bit envious of this design. If only building in real life was anything as quick, easy, or cheap as it is in Minecraft. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Andover is well and truly up and running, but there's still so much left to build. However, in the next episode, I will return to the estate and finally get to the smelting stations that I've kept pushing back. Those are important elements in my production capacity, so the sooner they're up and running, the easier things will go for me. I really could have used them when smelting all my freaking bricks in this episode, but as they say, hindsight is 20/20. In the meanwhile, I hope this finds you and yours in good health, good spirits, and perhaps a touch of good fortune. So take care of yourselves out there. Cheers.